Hi, I'm Dr. Ray Lau, and welcome to EAD 829, Community Relations and Educational Advocacy. And this is Module 6, Publication and Oral Presentations. And in this video, we're going to talk about one of the most effective communication techniques that we have at our disposal. And unfortunately, too often, people miss it. And yet it's so extremely effective because this is how we have communicated, how human beings have communicated for forever. And that's through the use of stories and through storytelling. And so we're going to get some experience telling a story, crafting a story, and being able to incorporate it into some of our oral presentations and our communication. So let me start with a story, to give you an example that I like to tell. It's about my student teaching experiences. I was student teaching in 1982 in Boulder, Colorado. I was at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And the school that I student taught at was Crestview Elementary School. And I had the most unusual cooperating teacher, my supervising teacher. His name was Monty Whiteley. Monty was in his 70s, still teaching 6th grade. And he was one of those people, he was just a real character. The kind of character that the administration tried to get to retire or tried to fire him, and he just resisted every time. And the parents loved him. All the children in the class were children of his former students from years ago. So he was an institution. But Monty would drive his 1959 Ford Edsel every day to school. Now here is this car. It had decades of exposure to the weather. It was this washed out, sun-bleached red car, this Edsel. And he would drive it to school. And every day, Monty would come in, and he always wore one of those beige jackets that I don't know if he was cold or it was just a place to keep his cigarettes at. He always smoked Virginia Slims. And I remember that because it has to do with part of this story, in that Monty, on the first day of my student teaching, as I walked into the classroom, he passed me on the way out. And he said, "Kid, if you need me, I'll be in the lounge." And in 1982, that would have been the smoker's lounge with those Virginia Slims cigarettes that he was smoking nonstop. Well, I thought this was great because here was my first classroom. And this, as every student teacher believes, is the place where a revolution in American education was going to begin, right there with my 6th graders and me. And so it was nice having the class to myself with the students and not being micromanaged by a teacher. Well, Monty throughout the week would come and go. He'd stop in, he'd get more cigarettes, he'd mess around with the school store that he had set up in the classroom. But basically, he left me alone and left me to teach. And we were teaching like crazy, learning all sorts of things all week long. By Friday night, I was exhausted. I went to sleep until the next morning at 6:30. My phone rings, and I pick up the phone, and it's Monty. I said, "Monty, is everything okay?" He said, "Yes, Ray, everything's fine. Am I disturbing you? Because if it's a problem, I can call back." I said, "No, Monty, what's up?" He said, "Ray, I just have a question. On Tuesday, Jason came up and asked you a question. Do you remember that?" I go, "This is Saturday, Monty. Tuesday was a long time ago. I really don't remember it." "Well, I'll tell you, he asked you how your weekend was. Do you remember that?" I go, "Well, I guess I kind of remember it." He said, "Do you remember what you told him?" I said, "No." I guess I said, "It was okay." And then there was silence. "You jackass." This was what he was telling me. This is what he had to call me at 6:30 in the morning to start calling me obscenities. He said, "You completely missed the purpose." He didn't care about your weekend. Aren't you aware that his parents are going through a divorce? His father is in Detroit. He never sees his father. Maybe he was just looking for a little male attention. I completely missed that. And then he went on and he continued to critique my teaching from that week, just from those split-second mini observations of wandering in and out of the classroom. But Monty had a point. His point was not that I just blew this kid off, but his point was that every interaction with a child, every interaction, is an opportunity to deepen and extend the relationship. And on that Tuesday, I blew it. I blew him off. But that's a lesson from Monty that I'll never forget, have never forgotten all these years of decades of teaching and working in schools. Monty's critique of my teaching continued for 3 hours on the phone that morning. And it was just incredibly insightful, valuable gems that really formed me as a teacher. And then finally, he took a breath. And he said, Ray, I'm out of beer. You see, Monty had been drinking since he dialed my phone that morning at 6:30 in the morning. He said, Ray, I'm in no shape to drive to the liquor store. Would you mind picking up a case of Schlitz Tall Boys and bringing it to my house? I said, sure. So I got up, got dressed, go to North Boulder Liquors, and I buy a case of Schlitz Tall Boys. And I take it to Monty's house. He said, come on in. And so then we started drinking beer, well, Schlitz. And spent hours and hours more solving all the problems of American education. The insight was terribly incredible, just incredible. It was the kind of feedback I never got from my methods classes. It was only because of Monty and his keen observations and his commitment, his willingness to make me the best teacher I could be. And so that is how I came to learn that whenever we have an interaction with a child, no matter how fleeting, no matter how apparently on the surface unimportant it is, to that child, it's everything. It's that moment where it's you and me and the ability to deepen and extend that relationship with that child. So that's what I learned from Monty. That's the lesson that I've carried all this time. Now, I've used that story many, many times and incorporated it into my teaching. Whenever I would, as a school district administrator, welcome new teachers to the district, I always told that story because I wanted them to remember it. Because as human beings, we're wired to hear stories and to remember stories. Our brains work that way. So I'm going to share my screen now and talk about storytelling. And as future school leaders, we are going to talk about how you develop a story. What's a compelling story? And what's an appropriate use to use it? Stories engage, inspire, and change our lives. Jenny Riddle is a renowned Chicago storyteller, and this is what stories do. They engage you and me. They engage the speaker and the listener. They can inspire. They can truly change our lives. Simon Sinek said, stories are attempts to share our values and beliefs. Storytelling is worthwhile when it tells what we stand for. You know, we could do an introduction of ourselves. We could do bullet points. Went to this school, went to that school, got this degree, went to this job. But a story communicates, it shows, it demonstrates what we value and what we believe in. It tells what we stand for, and we do it in a memorable way. And that's really what leadership's all about. Sharing our beliefs, sharing our values, telling us, our audience, what's important, what's our priority. So let's talk about what your story is, because this is the thing about human beings. Everyone has a story. I've got my stories. You've got your stories as well. Now, I'm less concerned about the accurate, carefully crafted elements of a story, but just be aware of what goes into a story. Settings and characters. And it's got to be about yourself. I mean, you've got to be in this. You're certainly one of the characters in your story, because it's your story. But tell us about the setting. Where is it? What's it like? What's the problem? There's a rising action. There's some tension built up to the final climax. And then the falling action, the denouement, the resolution of this story. What was learned? What was the moral of the story? Now, I said I'm less concerned about the actual crafting of the story in this format, only because I'm not an English teacher. This isn't an English exercise. This is real life. And just be aware that these are the elements that make stories more effective. The important thing is just telling your story. And we'll talk about how to make your story more memorable. So the elements of stories, of good stories, they're honest. Well, sometimes people misinterpret. We're not making up stories. This isn't fiction. This is all nonfiction, with one exception. Sometimes you can take a little literary license for the purpose of having a richer story, but ultimately it's an honest story. It's personal. It's about you. You're at the core of this story. It's revealing. The thing about storytelling is the thing that makes it shows our humanity is because when we tell a story, we're becoming vulnerable. We're sharing our vulnerability. And that's what draws people in. It's that honesty. Now, a good story also illustrates your point. In my point about my student teaching, I walked away with that lesson about every interaction with a child, its opportunity to deepen and extend the relationship with that child. That story is a way of illustrating it. I made it memorable because of the details that I put in. The location, Boulder, Colorado. Some details about Monty as a character, 70 some plus years old, teaching 6th grade, the beige jacket, the sun-bleached Ford Edsel car. I don't know the last time I saw a Ford Edsel. They're all in the junkyards by now, I think. But it's memorable. We're painting a picture in the mind. Good story tells you what's important. I think from that story, you know what's important to me as a teacher. You probably can tell that the relationship between me and my students is critical. It tells you what you value. I value that relationship with students, that human relationship, not just how many points you got on a quiz, but rather about you and the place that I play as your teacher, with the place that I play in the life of that student. That's what I value. And it makes me human. I shared the fact that my supervising teacher didn't call me up to congratulate me, to tell me what a brilliant job I did. No, he told me I was a jackass. But I understood where it was coming from. And so I'm exposing myself. I'm sharing that vulnerability with you as the listener. Good stories do the following. They connect you and me. They connect human beings with each other. Makes us relatable. Because maybe if you were a teacher, or just think about the first job that you held and what how can you relate to my experience? Did you stumble through those first times in that job as a teacher or whatever, and the obstacles that you faced? Good stories illustrate. I don't just tell the lesson that I learned, but I showed how I learned it. And good stories demonstrate. They demonstrate my humanity, my vulnerability. They demonstrate that lesson that I was learning. Stories are unique because it's your story. It's all about you. It tells us what is important to you, what's important to me as a storyteller. It tells you, the listener, what do I value? What's important to me? Now, when you tell your story in a presentation, things to think about, the questions to ask yourself: did I connect with the audience? Was it a story that's relatable? You know, oftentimes the best stories tend to be when we messed up, because that's where some of the best learning comes from. And so sharing those vulnerabilities, the frailties, the mistakes that we've made, those are the things that everyone's made mistakes. Everyone's had things they don't want to brag about, although you don't ever want to mention, but that's a way to connect with the audience. Can the audience relate to me, to my situation? You're a teacher. You've done student teaching. You probably made some mistakes during student teaching. That's a way for the audience to relate, for you as my students to relate to me, because we have that common experience. It connected us. Am I being honest? You've got to be honest. These are true stories. And did it humanize me? Did it make me real? Did it share the same things that you and I have in common as human beings? So, am I honest? Did it reveal something about me? Did my story illustrate my point? Did I share what I value? What's important to me? Did I take a risk? Because that's really important. Again, taking that risk is something that the listener values and appreciates, because it reveals your vulnerability. So let's do a little exercise in this video. Once upon a time, this is how oftentimes stories start. Think about, what was the best day at school this year? Whether it was virtual, whether it was face-to-face, whether it was hybrid, pause the video right now after I'm done with these instructions and think about that. Either write down some notes or tell the story to yourself about that best day at school this year. And I'll just give you a second here to pause it, and then we'll pick up with that story. Okay, and now you've come back. And now let's think about your story. If we were face-to-face and doing this, we would hear your story. You would share your story to a partner, and then the partner would give feedback. And then we would continue to expand that story and to build upon the story. And the way we do that is to look critically at your story and look at the details. Did you gloss over some things? Because this is where the story becomes more vivid. I specifically threw in some details that really had nothing to do with the lesson about the relationship between that student and myself, but rather I threw in those details so that your eye can better see that story. So, colors. You may recall the colors of the car. Sometimes talk about the time of the year, the temperature, what were you feeling? Think of the 5 senses that you were experiencing at the time of your story, whatever that setting was. Incorporate some of those elements, some of those senses, so that it becomes more visceral, more real to us. What was the temperature? What are the visuals? What was around the setting? Who else was there? What did they look like? Any unusual characteristics, smells? Use those five senses. Now, here's the reason that we tell the stories. Obviously, we tell it to connect with the listener. We tell it to demonstrate something. But what it is that we're demonstrating, it's the lesson of the story. What's the moral of the story? This is the purpose of you telling that story. Now, I already said that my lesson, and the purpose for me telling you that story, was to share my belief about the relationship between the teacher and the student and what's important. But the beautiful thing about stories is that you can get multiple lessons out of the same story. So if you're the principal or the superintendent and you're giving a speech to the Rotary Club, and then you're doing a staff development, and then you're giving a presentation to the Board of Education, you can have a set of stories in your back pocket that are adaptable, that you can then use for different settings. So I told you in my story that I opened with, the moral of that story was that every interaction with a student is the opportunity to extend and develop that relationship. What's another lesson? What else might you have gleaned about me from that story? Well, maybe it has to do with the value of a mentor, because I was working under a very wise, seasoned teacher. That might be the lesson of the story. If I was doing this presentation to a group of beginning teachers, and they're in one of these first-year teacher, second-year teacher programs where they have a mentor, that might be a story that I would introduce to them. You can keep digging and digging until, you can keep harvesting multiple lessons out of a single story, just putting a little different twist, a little different angle, a different emphasis. But that's the beauty. You don't need a new story for every single presentation. One story should probably get you 3 to 5 different lessons and morals of this story when you really think about it and work at it. So let's take a quiz, just to prove the point. Again, if we were face-to-face, we would do this in the large room with everyone else. But I want to give you a little quiz that I'm hoping will prove my point about how stories make things stick in your brain. So, what color was Monty's car? Maybe as a bonus, what kind of car was it? It was sun-bleached red, and it was a Ford Edsel, 1959 Ford Edsel. What brand of beer did Monty drink? Do you remember? Schlitz Tall Boys. What lesson was Monty teaching me? Every interaction with a student is an opportunity to deepen and extend the relationship. Now, these details about the color of the car, the kind of beer he was drinking, that's not important to the moral of the story, but it is important to the elements of the story. These are all elements that fill in, that add color to the story, that fill in details, that capture your attention and help you remember it. Because maybe you can relate to Schlitz beer. I can relate to it, not for the reason you're thinking, because as a junior high school student, we had to take German class. And the German field trip was going from Chicago to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We did 3 things there. We did the Mader's German restaurant for lunch. We went to the Goethe House for German literature. And then, of course, we did the Schlitz Brewery tour. Imagine today taking a group of 7th graders to a brewery for a field trip? Well, in 1972, that's what you did. But I tell you that because that's how I can relate to Schlitz. That's something that I can relate to. Maybe you had an old car. Maybe you're a fan of cars. Maybe you know something about Edsels. I put in those details because they add richness to the story and they help you understand it. They help you remember the story. It becomes memorable. Now it's time to share your amazing stories. They're relatable, they're believable, they're evocative, they're emotive, they're contagious, they're inspiring, they're useful, they're important, they're inclusive, they're unifying. They're your stories. It's your story. And that's why it's amazing and so important, because we all have stories. And as a public speaker, whether you are speaking to, again, the Rotary Club, the Board of Education, a staff meeting, make your speeches more interesting by incorporating stories, because stories is the way that as human beings we've communicated and passed on the culture and passed on lessons and the morals. We've passed on our culture and our history. So tell your story. Have a handful of stories that you're able to use depending on the kind of presentation, the setting. And enjoy your story. One other thing too that I just want to throw in, people always talk, should I read my story or should I memorize it? I personally, when I do storytelling, I kind of like to read my stories, but it's better when you're off book, when you're just speaking from memory. And even you don't even have to memorize your story, because here's the dirty little secret. It's your story. No one else knows it like you do. So tell your story, be honest, be open, and you will be a powerful, powerful communicator and speaker. And thank you very much. We'll continue this discussion now and talk about how we apply these stories into our public presentations and into our communication with legislators and others in the pursuit of educational advocacy. Thank you.